All right, y'all. Good evening. Welcome to another episode of the Dr. React series with yours truly, Dr. Pierre, favorite board certified internist. And this week we are going to be talking about Black health disparities, which obviously on a Thursday evening probably doesn't sound like a sexy topic to talk about, but it's going to lead to a future episode that we're going to do focusing on a young woman who recently passed away. I'm not sure they recently passed away, but at least it hit the news that they recently passed away. Jessica Petway, I guess it was a YouTuber, makeup artist, and discussions of cervical cancer, misdiagnosis or delayed diagnosis. Stories kind of in the middle. But I wanted to obviously kind of give a foundation of just this aspect of like how health disparities are as old as dirt, especially here in this country, and how essentially from the beginning of time, especially when we talk about medicine and healthcare, how this is not only nothing new, but this has unfortunately been kind of ingrained in our system. And when I just look back to the past 3 years, and I think about how COVID and the pandemic, predominantly affected, or more importantly, highlighted the already foundational disparities that were in our residential system, within our school system, was in our ventilation system. Again, just environmental factors that you couldn't run away from. You could, and when you see more highlighted reports of increased risk of Black maternal fetal death. And, you have people like even Serena Williams, superstar, who has to kind of use her celebrity status and power to say, hey, something is going on. And you tend to see that focus on the community of Black women and just Black health in general. And then you look at our history, like it's not a surprise, right? And this article was done last month in the, who is this again? KFF, which is a great source for very independent research, and Kaiser Family Foundation. And they just kind of talked about like, hey, you know what? This Black health disparities, this is nothing new here, right? Like we are used to having to deal with a different system when it comes to Black health. And a lot of times the focus is usually on the end result. How, especially in the Black community, higher rates of hypertension, higher rates of high cholesterol, higher rates of diabetes, higher rates of end-stage renal disease, stroke, all of these cancer-related deaths. Like every disease process you can think about tends to affect our community more. And it's not by surprise, right? It's not by accident. It's not that, they eat totally much different than others. No, that's not the case. We just have foundational processes in our system of healthcare that have allowed us to get to the point where like it is what it is. And even though we have, creators like myself and others who will scream from the rooftops and will champion from the rooftops, we understand that we have an uphill battle to climb. I think one of the more famous or more commonly referenced instances is when they talk about Tuskegee and everything about Tuskegee. And that was at the center of it, especially when I think about the pandemic and COVID and how our community was very apprehensive on any discussion of a vaccine or like, no, you're not going to do that on me. We saw what y'all do with Tuskegee. And of course, as a Black physician, I have to, understand where they're coming from, right? I can't shoo it away like, all right, you know what, y'all are getting that from nowhere. Like I have to recognize like, no, there's some foundation when they reference, hey, you know what, I might not take this vaccine or I might not trust this vaccine because of what y'all did in Tuskegee, right? So I have to acknowledge that. And I think especially in the healthcare system, we do a bad job of just acknowledging our wrongs. Many of the medical advances, especially when we talk about maternal health, are centered around atrocities associated and done to black women, right? In fact, like here, like this link right here, how history has shaped racial and ethnic health disparities, is a great link. And I will put, for those who may catch this later or may want to follow it, I'll put this link in our YouTube show notes tomorrow, and it'll be in the podcast show notes tomorrow as well too. But it's like if you just Google KFF in this title, you'll get to the article, because one of the first thing it highlights is that in the first 60 years, especially after they said, hey, you know what? Slavery is bad. We don't want you importing any slaves anymore. The amount of experiments that were done specifically to black women for the advancement of medicine. Like the things we talk about and the things we like are proud, like people don't know about Henrietta Lacks, but when we talk about some of our medical advancements, but when you go to look of like, hey, how does medical advancement get to where it's at today? These are some of the issues that we tend to run with. So it's important for us to, one, acknowledge, like, yes, there is fundamental issues and problems awry, especially when we talk about our healthcare system, but especially when we talk about our healthcare system to the black community. Like my wife, she is the CEO and founder of Autism in Black, right? We're actually working on her 4th annual conference, right? As we speak, right? Shameless plug. In fact, next week we'll have her on this live show. But what we tend to see, especially when we just say, hey, autism in the black community, that there are people who will be like, no, why do you have to focus on race? Why do you have to separate it by race? Like there are people who don't like when you say, you know what? I'm only going to center this health discussion on black people and on the black community. There are people who absolutely hate it. I know why, right? Because, when you're not centered, you feel threatened. But you have to do so, right? And you have to kind of look and see, hey, historically, what have we done to get us to this point? So you understand, all right, these are the steps that I can't make the mistake again. Like I kind of mentioned in my kind of intro, next week I'm going to be talking about, Jessica Patway, who was a YouTuber who passed away from cervical cancer. And there's discussion of, medical distrust. There's discussion of medical misdiagnosis or even delayed diagnosis. It's just more hearsay, but we're going to have kind of a good discussion based on that, because it just kind of segues into a lot of the discussion when we talk about where we're at here in the year 2024 when it comes to dealing with black health and acknowledging that, yes, there's some inefficiencies. Like when I listened to her story, at least I read parts of the story. I'm like, wow, I could see where, she was led astray. And I can see, wow, you know what? Maybe if she would have trusted the medical health system earlier, she'd still be here today, right? I can see kind of both sides, right? Like I said, we're going to discuss that next week. But when we talk about just these aspects of health disparities, we have to go to the fact that, historically, just like there were laws and rules that said, hey, you know what? If you're in this type of community, we're going to treat you this way. There are studies that have shown, and even as recent in the past decade, where you still had students who were going to be physicians who assumed that being black meant you felt less pain or felt pain differently, or you didn't experience depression, or like just things that doesn't make any sense in the world in the common sense type of discussion. But unfortunately, it's ingrained in a lot of people's train of thought. And when it's ingrained in people's train of thought, when the students, the people who are going to be the ones taking care of us, because there's not a lot of me's around, right? There's not a lot of black physicians. There's definitely not a lot of black male physicians. Whole nother discussion. So the likelihood that you're going to be taking care of someone who is outside of the community, like, is so significantly high. But those people who are outside the community don't feel that, hey, you know what? This person doesn't feel pain. Like when they have these types of thoughts, or when they think historically based off what they read in books, what they read in studies, that certain medications work better than others, like this is what continues to drive home this onus of misdiagnosis and delayed diagnosis. When we talk about, and cancer is some of the biggest ones, right? When I talk about, and I typically monthly will highlight some cancer, right? Whether it be prostate, colon, lung, breast. And I always keep, that's just me. I always keep a segue to say, hey, like in our black folks, right? Black community, what are we doing here? The trend always is, not only are we diagnosed later, not only do we have a higher barrier to even get diagnosed, but because we're diagnosed later, guess what? We die more, and we have less treatment options to deal with the diagnosis. So it becomes this, kind of circular train of, I got diagnosed late, there's less options to treat me, so I'm going to die more, right? And then that circle just continues to happen over and over again. And when we have just a system that not only perpetuates this, but unfortunately continues to, again, in the year 2024, have evidence where we just haven't seemed to make any headway or any crossroads in changing this, especially from a fundamental standpoint. Like, I can see why people would be mistrusting of the healthcare system. Like, do I think they mistrust me personally as a physician? No. I just think they understand that, like, yeah, Dr. Pierre, like, that's cool that you got to that position, but you're just one of a small bunch, and that whole system behind you, like, doesn't treat me the same. That whole system behind you, make sure that the medications I have aren't as effective as other medications. That whole system behind you makes sure that when you have studies that are available, I don't get access to those studies. So I can't even tell you if those medications work better for me or not. And then on the flip side, even if those studies were available, I don't trust what you're going to do with those studies, because which I do with Tuskegee, right? Like, so again, that's why I know Tuskegee is like this trump card for a lot of people, but I allow people to play it because unfortunately it's one of those things where if you don't acknowledge, like, yeah, these are some problems, right? These are some issues at hand. And historically we've had issues, from the get-go. Like, you're not going to solve anything, right? Like, this article is great, right? Because it talked about how Black people are more likely to face healthcare barriers, have worse outcomes, which we kind of already knew. It talked about how this aspect of, and I kind of mentioned, how you have medical students who think that, Black people experience less pain. You have this issue of, there were certain studies that pointed to the fact that, like, oh, if you're Black, only medications work certain ways for you. And I kind of mentioned, especially from a residential standpoint, especially when we kind of tied in with COVID, we were segregated in certain areas, right? Certain areas of the community. And because we were segregated in certain areas of the community, guess what? We had less issues as far as, getting access to a good grocery system, good food, healthier foods. We had poor buildings, poor ventilations in our buildings, right? So especially if you have a airborne related disease, guess what? You're going to have problems getting rid of that airborne related disease, right? So you had all of these things that when the pandemic hit, got highlighted and said, hey, wow, guess what? Like, I didn't realize this whole community, like, there are some people who are generally shocked that you had certain, slots of the community that did not have access to good ventilation, that you had certain schools that didn't have access to be able to kind of spread their desk out and, be able to kind of social distance. Like, you had a lot of people who were generally shocked at that, right? And that's where our system, especially those within the system like myself, we kind of continue to have to not only acknowledge, right, the Jessica Pett ways, right, and say, yes, I can see how our system failed you, right? We have to acknowledge that. Now, there are parts of her story where I'm like, I don't know, I got some questions. There are parts of the story, but because I know historically what we've done, like, there's some parts of the story I gotta be like, man, it's possible. Like, it's possible that you can have episodes, especially for those who don't know the story. Like I said, we're going to go much more detail on the Medicine Mondays episode next week. So, like, that way we piecemeal it, because I don't want to do her a disservice by dropping a piece here, dropping a piece here. We'll actually go into pretty good detail for it, and we'll have a good discussion on just vaginal bleeding, right? And again, mind you, I'm an internist, not an OB-GYN, but as an internist, Unfortunately, a lot of times, I'm one of the first people who tend to, who people tend to see and say, hey, this is the chief complaint that I have. It just, just unfortunately, it is what it is, especially in the primary care world. So you have this aspect of, is there some possibility of misdiagnosis? Is there some possibility of delayed diagnosis? These are all things that always affects our community much more. Oh, hey, Dr. Craig, appreciate you for joining. Right, so we have all of these instances here where like we have to scream from the rooftops when instances like this happen, right? Because I don't want people, right? Because there's always gonna be two sides, right? I don't want people to kind of look at her story and be like, yeah, ain't no way all of that stuff happened and, no one paid you any mind or everyone just kind of, brush you to the side. No, because there's going to be people who do that. Like I see the comments. There definitely are. And so you want to say, hey, you know what? Let's not like throw her story out completely, right? Because we got some historical, unfortunately, historical data that says, yes, like this is not only likely to happen in a system like this, but this is possible, right? In fact, I just want to kind of talk about some of the things that happened. Like I said, I definitely suggest you check out the Kaiser Family Foundation. So these were just some of the things that, and this is just from 1808 to 1865, right? The first thing talks about the medical exploitation of enslaved Black women, right? This is how our healthcare system started, right? Like this is how like it came about. Oh, Dr. Great, like no, I'm teasing it because I am going to have a prolonged, a much more in-depth discussion on that aspect. But I did want to highlight because I saw some people, and Dr. Craig asked, and let me highlight it just for those who are on the live, because Dr. Craig asked a great question. He said, "Are we talking about the women who died from cancer because the doctor ignored concerns?" Yeah, so we teased it. We're gonna go in much more in depth because I saw people who were immediately discounting her story as like, no way a doctor's gonna miss that. No way, they're gonna brush that off. No way, no. Like I saw that immediately. And again, as a physician, like when I see it, I'm like, okay, I have questions. I do have questions at timeline and things that happen, but because I understand that our system, especially in healthcare, is good for missing some stuff, especially on Black women, for delaying some stuff, especially for Black women, because I know our system is good for that. Like I can't be like, yeah, nah, that ain't never, like I don't believe it, right? Like I think there's certain scenarios one way or the other, how you could get to a point where, you have this delay of care or I'm not even sure about the misdiagnosis standpoint, but again, that's just, I can't push it off completely because I understand that it's a possibility, right? Like, and that's the scary thing, that it's a possibility that someone can have all of those symptoms and it totally get missed. It's a possibility that someone can have all of those symptoms and it totally get brushed by as, oh, it's just fibroids. Like that's a possibility. So I don't want us to, and I don't want people to kind of 100% discount what she says. But I do, right? And especially as a physician, right? Because again, like I say, I'm in the field, right? So I got to fight for us a little bit. What I do find is that, and especially if you go, I go to a lot of conferences. I go to a lot of conferences where people are kind of telling motivational type stories. And I do find that like going against a doctor or going against the healthcare system seems to be a foundation for a lot of people's like healthcare, or just motivational stories. Like, oh my God, the doctor told me this and I ain't believe them. And I went out and did greatness, right? Like, so of course I'm looking as a physician. I'm like, all right, fam, like relax on us a little bit, right? Like, let's, we do some good, right? But I understand, right? There's some people who, they take that motivational nugget and they kind of run with it from that standpoint there. Chris, I apologize for saying this wrong. Crystal Felice says delays in care can be disastrous. We see it all the time in ER. Oh yeah, most definitely, right? And when we talk about Black healthcare disparities, a lot of it is literally based on the delay of care. When I talk about how the effects of high blood pressure, and when we talk about strokes, when we talk about heart attacks, when we talk about going on dialysis, getting your foot amputated, a lot of it is because someone didn't recognize that, hey, I got high blood pressure, or someone didn't have access to care to say, hey, I got high blood pressure. Let me give you a blood pressure medication that's probably free. Right? Let me give you a blood pressure medication that's probably free so that in 20 years, you're not walking to the ER after having a stroke or a heart attack. Right? When someone has diabetes and they don't recognize they have diabetes, they don't even recognize the signs and symptoms because someone, like myself, isn't there to say, hey, these are the signs and symptoms of diabetes. And then they let their diabetes run amok. And then all of a sudden they're having vision issues. All of a sudden, they're also, and I tell people all the time, diabetes, a lot of people focus on the sugar aspect of it, but it's one of the most severe vascular disease problems that you can ever think of. Because you can have strokes, you can have heart attacks, you can have kidney failure, end up on dialysis, right? And that's just delay of care. So delay of care has always been centered in the forefront of just the foundation of our healthcare disparities, right? Like if you had to say what is the main reason why, the Black community, or just most of communities, but definitely the Black community tends to face a lot of healthcare disparities, it's because the care gets delayed one way or the other. It gets delayed in diagnosis, it gets delayed in treatment. And when it gets delayed in diagnosis and treatment, guess what? We have less options for treatment, and then people end up dying more. So this aspect of delay of care really is foundational when we talk about why are we in our community is facing so much disparities that we can't seem to get ahead of it. That even when you factor in socioeconomic status, and you can be as rich and famous as a Serena Williams, you can still experience issues in Black maternal health that you would think a person as rich and famous as Serena Williams would not have to face. Like you would think oh, nah, she got money. She's, she's Serena Williams. Like she shouldn't have these problems, but no, it doesn't matter, right? Because in healthcare, a lot of that stuff gets factored in. And if that person doesn't believe that you're in that much pain, if that person doesn't believe that your symptoms aren't just you being quote unquote emotional, right? If they don't believe that, it is what it is, right? So I think that's where, we really have to continue to acknowledge our community, right? Because I saw a lot of people discounting her completely. And again, like I said, I have questions, right? I got questions as a physician. I got questions on, how that process kind of went about. Like I said, we'll discuss it next week. But as just a Black person in general, and just kind of knowing the history behind our healthcare system, I understand that when you have instances where our healthcare, right, literally, the foundation of our healthcare starts out with the medical exploitation of enslaved Black women. When you have someone like Dr. Francois Marie Provost, who honed his cesarean surgical procedure by practicing on enslaved women. And they would not, and didn't give them anesthesia. Guess what? Because they didn't think they were in that much pain. This is where, of course, you think about C-sections right now, and you're cool. You're like, oh yeah, give me a C-section. Not realizing historically, the reason why we can do C-section is because the doctors practice on enslaved women without giving them anesthesia. Right, like that is, again, I don't want to, this Thursday evening, I know the weekend about to come up. I'm not here to sour any grapes, right, or sour any moods for the weekend. But I want us to understand that when we have a lot of positive, especially in healthcare, I don't know about these other, like I said, I don't know about law and others. I can tell you in healthcare, a lot of the things that we say, oh my God, I'm so glad for the medical advancements of this. I understand, right? I understand that, man, for us to kind of get there, likelihood our community had to be the test, the guinea pigs of it, right? I put down a medical practice right after the book talked about this. Oh yeah, no, it is tough. It is tough out here, right, for our community. And even in the year, like I said, like this is 1845, year 2024, we're still dealing with disparities that still continue to affect us just disproportionately. And that's just something that we just, again, as a community, it's Americans, just Black community, like we just have to understand when our community members call out, right? When we see, the Jessica Patways call out and say, hey, you know what? They didn't even diagnose me. They didn't even look at me. We have to like look at it with a certain eye, say, hey, you know what? I'm not going to go out on a limb and be like, I don't know about all that. Like, and that's what I saw a lot of people doing. So I figured, this week on the Doctors Reacts, we'll talk about health disparities. And then when we go in on her more next week, it'll be more, like I said, it'll be good educational discussion, right? We'll just talk about, vaginal bleeding, right? We'll talk about, hey, start having vaginal bleeding. What should you do? And we'll kind of entwine her story there. But I did want to just kind of talk about it because I do, like I said, this article just, like last month, right? So this is an ongoing thing, right? This isn't something where you can have someone be like, come on, guys, like it's not that serious, or like that's old news. No. Like this is still unfortunately going on to this day. And we're going to continue to have more stories like this, right? We're going to continue to have more stories of misdiagnosis, delay of diagnosis, and people who on both sides say, you know what, I don't think it was that. And you kind of need people like myself to say, hey, let's pump our brakes here because the possibility of something like that happen isn't zero, right? And I think that's, as a physician, right, before I get out of here, I think as a physician, that's probably that's the sad story about that, is that I can't 100% say, you know what, I'm not sure if her story is on the up and up, right? Like I can't 100% say that because I'm in a system that I can 100% see how that goes down. I can 100% see how you can have a person who have that much vaginal bleeding and no one looks, right? And no one thinks to look, right? Like I can unfortunately definitely see that, right? And again, I don't even know if she was insured or not. That's a whole nother discussion. When we talk about health disparities, obviously, whether you're insured or uninsured plays a significant factor in healthcare disparities in general. And guess which community tends to be uninsured or underinsured, right? Like it's, again, every time, like when we talk about these issues, like I can just point to like, all right, this is why our community is affected more. This is why I tend to do what I do, where I get on this health education and, I get online and do these things here because I understand that there are people who don't have access to a Dr. Barry Pierre in their community, and even if they have access, one of their family members don't have access, or one of their family members, for them to even have a discussion like this, would probably have to pay $50 to $75 to $100 copay if they have insurance to even pay the copay. Right, like this is it just unfortunately is what it is for our current state. So you need our healthcare content creators, especially the Black ones, or those who support the Black community, which should be everybody. You need us to continue to kind of become the voice of those who just don't have the voice out there. Right, it just is what it is. Right. So again, for those who caught this late, we will put this on our YouTube page tomorrow. And podcast episode, I think, comes out on Saturday, which is essentially just the audio version of this. I will have a link to this article, which I definitely suggest. It's a quick read. And I like the site because it's patient friendly, right? Like, and by patient friendly, I mean non-doctor, like you don't have to be a physician to go read these articles and understand what they're actually saying. So I love that. And I definitely suggest you click that link here, that how history has shaped the racial and ethnic health disparities, because it gives a great timeline. And you can just kind of see like, man, like medicine was not good for Black folks. It just wasn't, right? Like, yes, I appreciate all of the advances. And I do think with the advances in technology, with the advances of, social media and people getting on here and, giving education and giving game, I do think that helps us, right? Because it helps overcome some barriers that are within a lot of our communities we can't necessarily overcome. So I do think that is a benefit, but I think it's one of those trickle down effects where I don't want us to be one of the last people, right, to receive that benefit, right? We need to be on the forefront, and to do so, right, we have to know about it. We have to know about it. We have to educate ourselves about it, and we have to be accepting of what's kind of going down, right? So stay tuned next week. Next week's gonna be a good one. Next week we'll be talking about Jessica and if I don't, I'm trying to figure out. I may do it for a Medicine Mondays, which is my Monday episode on the YouTube. If I do it for a Medicine Mondays, then it won't be next week. It'll be the week after. But like I said, we'll get to talking. We'll get to talking for it. We'll have some clips. Make sure you follow. I appreciate all the likes and hearts and follows. You guys are amazing, and I'm gonna see you guys next week.